All right, we're ready for Judges chapters 12 and 13 in our study of the book of Judges. And this is where we've been and where we're going. This is the outline we're following from Wiersbe. We're in the second section of those of apostasy, of that departure. And that takes in most of the period of the Judges. We are in chapter 12. This is the alternate outline, Micah's outline we've looked at. And we're in the section of the work of the judges is where we are. All right, let's move on from that as we talk about the, I can get my remote to work. The cycle of the judges. Now this, we've looked at each time in the cycle of the judges. I think I went too far. We just shut down. You know, we got technical difficulties tonight. But the cycle of the judges. Let's talk about the cycle of the judges. I'll bring it back up in a moment. We just completely shut down here for a moment. But the cycle of the judges we've been talking about, and I've shared that with you each time, of the cycle they go through of they depart and go into sin after having been serving God faithfully for a while. They go into sin. God allows an oppressing nation to come. They cry out for deliverance. God sends a deliverer, and they are delivered, and then they go back into serving the Lord again. Okay, while that's interesting and true for most cases, part of that story is missing in our study tonight, as we're going to see in just a moment, when we get to chapter 13, that cycle. Here we go. We're going to see them going back into sin. We're going to see an oppressing nation when we get to chapter 13. We've still got 12 to go yet. But one of the things that doesn't seem, they may have done it, but the text doesn't record when we get to chapter 13, is this crying out for deliverance. And why is that? Was the oppression different? Maybe so. We'll talk about the significance of that. Or is it that they're just not crying out to the Lord? I don't know. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 13 here in a second. Let's go to question number 1. Let's talk about the summary of chapter 12. What's chapter 12 about? All right, Jephthah's conflict with Ephraim. Anything else? Very good. All right, 3 more judges that are mentioned here, very briefly mentioned, but yet some significant things said about each of those. So here are the judges we will have by the time we get through. There are 15 in all, maybe 16, depending on if you include one along with Deborah that we talked about when we were at that juncture. But we have Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, and Jephthah. That's where we are. And then we're going to see 3 judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, are 3 that are briefly mentioned. And then we're introduced to Samson, which will carry us through chapter 16. So chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 all will deal with Samson. So then we only have 2 more to go, and that is Eli and Samuel. And that'll be the list of the judges. So yes, chapter 12. Let's go to chapter 12 now. And to answer question number 3 before we go to the outline, what judge or judges are found in this week's lesson, you should have had those that we just mentioned there. That is Jephthah is mentioned there, and Ibzan, and Elon, and Abdon, and Samson. So there should be 5 judges that you have listed in tonight's lesson. One of those we're introduced to in the previous study, and one will finish in future studies in the next 2 weeks. But this is those 5 in answer to question number 3. All right, here's chapter 12, Jephthah's conflict, and then we have 3 more judges introduced. Let's talk about the conflict first, but I want to back up to chapter 11 just to remind ourselves of what we saw about Jephthah. When we were introduced to Jephthah in verses 1 and 3, now we're in chapter 11, just for a review, what were we told about Jephthah at verses 1, 2, and 3 of chapter 11? Because he was the son of a harlot, he was driven out. He was expelled. Now then what happens, beginning about verse 4? All right. Because of the conflict now with Ammon, with the Ammonites, Gilead goes back to Jephthah and wants to make him the leader. And so much of the chapter is devoted to this dispute between the king of Ammon and Jephthah. And the king of Ammon was saying, you've taken our land, you need to give it back to us. And he pointed out that's not the case at all. We reasoned through all of that. And then at the end of the chapter was where he had made or in the middle of the chapter where he made the vow that whatever comes out of my house, I'll devote to the Lord. And when he comes back, what happens? His daughter came out and he did exactly what he said he would do. But he had victory over the nation of Ammon. In other words, they were subdued. So here was the oppressing nation, and they're subdued. Now, here we have a reaction from Ephraim. This is not the first time Ephraim's had a negative reaction. We'll talk about that here in a second. But let's get verses 1 to 3. The men of Ephraim come to fight with Jephthah, and we'll talk about the reason for that. The men of Ephraim gathered together, and they crossed over toward Zaphon, and they talked to Jephthah. So let's look on the map and get where this is taking place. Let me zoom that in just a little bit and give you a better picture of what's going on. The battle has taken place at Mizpah. Earlier we've talked about, but it's right here. This is the Jordan River, by the way, and the land of Gilead, and of course this is the nation of Israel over here. But anyway, Zaphon is where they came and met with him, and what they say to him, verse 1. Yeah. Why didn't you when you crossed over to fight with them, why didn't you call us to go with you? And they didn't wait for a response. But what do they say then? Why didn't you call us to go with you? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to burn down your house. Didn't wait for an answer, didn't wait for a response. They've already made their decision what they want to do. Now let's back up a little bit to chapter 8. This is the same people that we saw in chapter 8 with Gideon. When Gideon went out to battle with the Midianites, it was the tribe of Ephraim that had the same response here. Similar response, very similar response. Go back to chapter 8, verse 1. Why have you done this by not calling us to go out with you to fight with the Midianites? And they reprimanded him sharply. So they go to Gideon and said, you were fighting with them and we should have gone with you and you shouldn't have gone without us. How did Gideon respond to that? Chapter 8, beginning at verse 2. Go ahead. Yeah, he did. He kind of stroked their ego that what you've done and what you accomplished is of more significance and greater than what I did. And when he said that, what happened? It abated, their anger was abated. In other words, that satisfied them. Now, I mentioned that because I want to, maybe there's a contrast here between this and what we see in our chapter tonight. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But nonetheless, what I wanted you to notice is this seems to be some petty tribal jealousy here seems to be what's going on. Between the tribes, that you're going and you're accomplishing what you're accomplishing. I wish you'd called for us to go. One of the reasons may have been, and this is speculation and conjecture we talked about when we were there in chapter 8, it may be that because of the number of spoils, we missed out on the spoils. I wish you'd have called us and we could have gained the spoils along with you, though they don't say that. Well, let's go now to chapter 12. Same tribe, same people, same kind of criticism that they've offered before. And they said, why didn't you go out to call us when you go out to battle? What did Jephthah say? Verses 2 and 3. Let me read the text if you haven't read that, and then I want you to help me summarize what he said. That he said, my people and I were in great struggle with the people of Ammon, and when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hand. And so when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over to the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. And why have you come up to me this day to fight against me? What did you say? Yeah, I went and did it myself. When I needed you, you weren't there. Somebody started to say something. Yes, yes. That's interesting, isn't it? They show up after the fact and, oh, we would have liked to have helped. Why didn't you ask us? Well, the invitation was there and you didn't respond. Now, one author makes this observation, and I think it's worth noting that he actually said three things in those two verses. Number one, that he was saying, my first concern was to defeat Ammon. I wasn't, and I know we're adding to and amplifying, I guess, the point. But when he says it, verse 2, my people and I were in great struggle with the people of Ammon. In other words, my first concern was fighting Ammon. It wasn't who all was included. Does that make sense? It's kind of like, what if a fire broke out in this building and Ricky jumps over here and puts the fire out, and I go over and reprimand him. I wish you'd have called me. I'd like to help. Well, his first concern was get the fire out. Doesn't matter. Oh, I want to include Donnie in this, and I don't want to be the only one to put the fire out. That's not your first concern. You see to the problem, and you're not trying to include everybody on that point when you're in a fight. And so one author made the observation. He says, first of all, my first concern was fighting Ammon and defeating Ammon. Now, really wasn't worried about you, number one. Maybe that's what he's saying. Secondly, that during the 18 years, remember this has gone on for 18 years, this oppression. During the 18 years, that no one from Ephraim had offered to help during the whole 18 years. What had Ephraim done to fight them? What had they done to offset the oppression? Not a thing. And then thirdly, he says, I did call for help, and you didn't answer. So I went and did it. And as Ricky said, he shows up after the fact and says, okay, well, you wished you'd invited us to come and help. And again, it may be the spoils, it may be the credit, it may be the praise, whatever. They want to be a part of that. Their attitude didn't seem to be what it should be. Now, another author made this observation, and I'll just pass it on for what it's worth. I don't agree with this. I don't think that's correct, that Gideon handled this well over there by answering them softly, but Jephthah stirred them up to battle because he answered them roughly, and he should have handled it differently like Gideon did. I don't see maybe it's just my personality. I don't see a thing wrong with what he said. War or no war. I think I would have said that and then some maybe. All right. Anything else on verses 1 to 3 about the men of Ephraim coming to fight? Good point. Yeah, you did it all wrong because you went and fought him and didn't include us. If God was involved in that, and God did, then that's a good point. Who are you to argue with that? This is the way this was God's doings, and we did it without you, and that's fine. Good point. All right, let's begin at verse 4 to 7. Jephthah then fights against them. And beginning at verse 4, that he gathered together against all the men of Ephraim, and the men of Gilead defeated them. But now verse 4 is quite interesting. The men of Ephraim, what did they say to and about the men of Gilead? You're fugitives. You are renegades. The New International translates that. You're deserters from, you're fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. Those of you who are of Gilead, you're just fugitives that ran. In other words, it was a put down of them. And one writer suggests that they resorted to name calling, that you're just nothing but renegades. You're just a bunch of fugitives and renegades and deserters is what you are. And then the battle ensued. Now at verse 5, the Gideonites, after they basically defeated them at this battle, now I had on the map a moment ago that they had gone across, people of Ephraim had gone across the river to confront, had a battle over there. Now they've got to go back home. What happens as they go back home? They've got to cross something major. Jordan River. You don't just cross it anywhere, but they came to the fords. What happens when they come to the fords or a crossing point at the river? They're there to catch everyone that escaped. In other words, they had a mass slaughter in the battle, but some are going to escape, and as they're escaping, they come back to the fords, and the people of Gilead, under the leadership of Jephthah, go down to the fords, and they block them there. Now, what did they do to make sure that people can get across, who ought to get across, and those who shouldn't? What did they do?
So then they would kill them if they could pronounce the word correctly. I don't know how to pronounce it myself. I'd be killed.
You'd be killed. So you're done. Yeah. You don't belong, Tim. And you ain't the only one in here. All right. Shibboleth. This is an interesting word. This is much like it is even, let's just take the United States. There's different pronunciations of words from one end of the Bedford County to the other. But let's go a little broader than that, from one portion of the United States than it is to another. For example, you go into Virginia or Eastern Kentucky or in the Appalachian region, their pronunciation of some words are going to be different. And that seems to be what they're talking about here. That people of Ephraim had a different emphasis of how they pronounced a word than they would somewhere else. And so that was the whole idea here. Have them say shibboleth, which literally means a flowing stream, which is what the Jordan River was. So when they come to the ford, we'll let you cross, but say shibboleth. And those of Ephraim could only, their way of pronouncing it is sibboleth. And that was a dead giveaway. Their speech betrays them. And they don't know this is a test. It was a test. And so if they pronounced it like the Ephraimites would, what would they do? Well, then they killed them, the text says. Now, how many were slaughtered here? 42,000 were killed. And the text says Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years, and he died, and he was buried in Gilead. Now, for what it's worth, that word, shibboleth, you look that up, this is dictionary.com from today, that there's no reference to how this was used with reference to this context of the biblical text. But it's a peculiar pronunciation, behavior, or dress of mode that distinguishes one class of person from another. It's a term that's used commonly, I understand. I don't hear it a lot, but it is used commonly in non-biblical settings because of this, that this describes those who are, they're a little different because of a certain region, the way they dress, the way they talk, etc. Well, that was what was going on right here for what that may be worth to us. All right. Now let's go further. I'll come back to a map later. I want to show you on the map some of the time frame of some of these judges, but let's go right now to these three judges. Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And in fact, I'm going to go on to our timeline. That's what I want to look at while we talk about that. This timeline. Since you've seen this, I put the numbers in of the oppression. The oppression is below the line, the Midianite oppression for 7 years, the Ammonites for 18 years. We're going to get to the Philistines for 40 years. That's the longest of the oppression, periods of oppression. Now we're moving on up here to this region right here because these are so small. Ibzan for 7 years, Elon for 10, and Abdon for 8 years. Now, we're going to make brief comments, and that's about all we're going to do here with reference to that. What do we know about Ibzan? Of Bethlehem. What do we know about him? Doesn't say much. All right, he had 30 sons, and he gave 30 daughters away in marriage and brought 30 daughters in from elsewhere, etc. So you think, what's the significance of that? You know, what difference it made if he had 2 sons or 30 sons or 40 sons? I think it may be a picture being painted here of kind of a development of thought through the period of the judges before we get to the time of the kings. Where, like we saw with reference to some of the judges before, like Gideon, who lived like royalty and lived like a king, and they wanted to make certain ones king. And so there's been this idea of the king rising up, and that thought has been popping up, though they haven't got a king yet. They're going to get one, but they haven't got it yet. And some of the judges were living like kings. And so several suggest the idea of them having 30 sons would suggest that they have a harem. And so here's a guy who's not just a military leader, but he's living like some of the kings who not only would have many wives, but he'd have his harem. And so he might have 30 sons and 30 daughters. That's 60 children he had. And so he judged Israel for 7 years. That's about all we see about him. Nothing great and significant. We're not even told who the oppressor was. Perhaps the Ammonites. There seems to be some co-regency during this time of overlapping, so it might have been partly during the time of the Ammonites, and more likely the time of the Philistines is more likely the time of their judging. The next one is Elon. He judged how long? 10 years. And then Abdon judged for how long? 8 years. And here we have a reference again of something we've seen previous, and you kind of wonder, what's the significance? I know it's significant or God wouldn't have taken the time and space. There's so much God doesn't tell us, but then he takes the time to tell us that they rode on 70 young donkeys. And you think, big deal, what's that about? Well, I think putting that in the time, that may suggest something of luxury, and again, living like kings. You say, well, that wouldn't mean a whole lot in our day and time if you said, well, this man's got 12 sons and they rode on 20 donkeys. Big deal. But I think it would be much like this man had, how many sons was it? He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode in 70 Mercedes or something of that nature, some luxury car. They had 70 Ferraris. That kind of tells you the life they're living. That's the life of royalty. They're living kind of on the high side of things. And I think that's the picture of many of the judges were edging toward royalty and kingship. And they're getting ready for a king, at least in attitude. Does that make sense? All right. Sounds good anyway. If it doesn't, I thought it sounded impressive. All right. Now let's go back to, let's go to chapter 13. Question number 2. What's chapter 13 about? I'm sorry? Birth of Samson is where we are. Birth of Samson. We have the announcement of his birth, and then we have his birth itself. Now, there's a great deal to learn in this about the announcement of his birth, and hopefully we'll have some time toward the end to develop some of the thoughts of practical things in this section. Let's get another question or two out of the way. Here, you should have answered, if you didn't have answers to questions 4, 5, and 6, we just went through that. And Ibzan judged again how many years? Not 6, not 8, but 7. Yes, and number 5, the answer was how many years? 10. And question 6, Abdon judged how long? 8 years. Question number 7, who was the enemy that oppressed God's people in the time of Samson? The Philistines. All right. So here's the cycle starting again. Verse 1 of chapter 13. Again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, let's tie 2 or 3 things to verse 1. First, as we've been looking at the period of the judges, notice that, again, below the line is the oppression. The Mesopotamian for 8 years, Moabite for 18 years, the Philistine for a little short time, and then there was the Canaanite for 20 years, and then there was the Midianite for 7 years. Abimelech was led in a period there for 3 years. Then there was the Ammonites for 18. And the point I want you to see is the Philistine oppression lasted longer than any of the oppressing nations during the whole period of the judges and on into the times of the kings. In fact, they're not completely defeated until the day of David. Make sense? We're going to see an indication of that here in just a moment about verse 5. Now, that's one thing. This is the longest period of oppression, 40 years of the Philistines. Now, let's go back to chapter 10, and in verse 7, yet the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. Now, we talked about this last time or time before. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them in the hand of the Philistines and into the hands of the people of Ammon. And so if you were just reading this for the first time in chapter 10, you think, okay, now the Philistines. So that raises a question. Well, then at verse 8, it shifts and talks about for 18 years, they were under the oppression of the Ammonites. But both are introduced at verse 7. So what is that? Well, one of two things we talked about. One is that might be verse 7 may be an introduction to the oppressing nations coming for some time. And then first turning to the first oppressing nation, which seems to be mapped out here. Let's first talk about the Ammonites, and then we talk about the Philistines, which came later. Some suggest that the Philistines were oppressing at the same time. The Ammonites were the stronger oppressor, but they overlapped. And that the Philistines were an oppressing nation during the same time. And it may not be distinct as mentioned, as graphed out here, but they may have been overlapping. And so which is it? I'm not sure. I want to think that there was a separation between the two. But anyway, for what that's worth, I just mentioned those points. Now, another thing I want to point out about verse 1, and then I want to talk more about the Philistine oppression when we get to verse 5. This is the point. I've just made a marginal note for myself, but I've already mentioned it to you earlier, that there is no statement in chapters 13 and 14 and 15 that I remember, and if you found it, then I want to know and I'll correct that. But I don't see a statement in any of this where it is stated they cried out for deliverance. And so most of the cases of the judges, they go into sin, God allows an oppressing nation to come, and then the statement follows, and we expect to hear next, they cried out for deliverance, and then God raised up a judge. But there's something missing there. There is no statement of them crying out for deliverance. So why is that not there? The answer is I don't know. It may be that they did, and the text doesn't record it. All right? But I don't see where they did. Another thought may be they're going further and further into sin, and they get at the point where they're not really interested in crying out for deliverance just yet. That may be. I can make sense of that. But I think more reasonable than those two is the fact that the oppression lasting for 40 years, as we just had right here, this oppression lasting for 40 years suggests the oppression was not as aggressive as the other forms of oppression. Make sense? We could have an oppressing nation puts pressure on us economically and is oppressing us, but they're not controlling us where we're ready to go to war just yet. Make sense? And that may be what was going on here. That they are forcing some things with reference to Israel and are at an agitation to Israel, but they are not having the dominating force over Israel. That to me makes more sense. Any suggestions or comments on that line before we go through chapter 13? Yeah. That doesn't seem to be as oppressive, and that makes sense why they're not crying out yet. And to me, that makes some sense that why the text doesn't say anything about them crying out is the oppression hasn't reached that level just yet. All right. Now let's go back here and let's work through verses 1 to 23. Here's the setting that we've just mentioned at verse 1, the oppression that lasted for 40 years. Now what we have next is verses 2 to 5. An angel tells the woman she's going to have a child. There was a certain man of the tribe of Dan. Remember, this would be Dan to the south. And I'll bring that up on a map a little bit later. There was a little sliver of Dan up to the north. Remember that? But there's down in the south, not far from Judah, on the sea coast, is a tribe of Dan. And of that tribe, a certain man from Zorah, of the family of the Danites, Manoah and his wife. And they were barren and had no children. Now what happens beginning at verse 2 through verse 5? All right, very good. You're going to have a child's going to be born to you. You'll conceive and bear a son. Verse 3. And this was similar to number 6 of the Nazirite vow, but there are some distinctions because in this case she was doing this on behalf of the child. Now she's going to, and that is not exactly described in number 6. Make sense? But it does talk about the Nazirite vow. There would be no razor touch the head. They were to not drink of any wine, and etc. Now, here's a key word at verse 5. And he shall begin, might underline that, to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. When we get through with Samson and he's dead, he will not have delivered them from the hand of the Philistines. Make sense? He shall begin to do that. Now what that tells me is, it's not going to be completed in his lifetime. So, what did he do? Did he do nothing? No, he was effective. Did he make some mistakes? We're going to talk about his sins, not tonight, but we're going to talk in 14 and 15 and 16, his sins and the mistakes that he made and his faltering. But he did fight against the Philistines. And so basically what he did, he kept them from devastating Israel. In other words, he kept them at bay. And were they still an oppressing force? They were. But he fought against them enough that he kept them at bay. For lack of a better expression. There may be a better expression, but I hadn't thought of it yet. So, anyway, that seems to be what he did. So he began the work. Now, beginning at verse 6 and 7, what happens at 6 and 7? She goes and tells her husband. What does she say about what she just saw? She concluded, though she's not been told this, that he was a man of God. She didn't say he was an angel. She said he's a man of God. That could have been a prophet, couldn't it? But he's a man of God. He came to me. But it was something different about him, though, she said. Yeah. Very awesome. And that's the sense of the King James terrible. Not terrible like he's ugly, but it's an awesome sight. It's a terrible, awesome sight like that of an angel of God. Very awesome. And I didn't ask him where he's from, and he didn't tell me his name. And here's what he said to me. She's telling her husband that you'll have a son, and you drink no wine nor eat anything, for the child shall be a Nazirite from the womb to the day of his death. That's what he's supposed to be all of his life. He's going to be devoted to the Lord. And that's what he told me. Now, that's 6 and 7. So she runs and tells Manoah. Now, verses 8 to 14. What's the very first thing Manoah does? Absolutely. Manoah prayed to the Lord, and you might underline here because we're going to see this twice. Let the man of God whom you sent come again and teach us what? What we shall do for the child who will be born. Every preacher's got a sermon based on that verse. Every parent needs to have that prayer. Lord, teach me what I shall do for this child who will be born. Teach me, Lord, what I need to do for this child. I want to raise this child like you want. He's not through with that. We're going to see more about that in a moment. But what a powerful verse. What a sermon that would make. Teach us what we shall do for the child that will be born. Not, please, Dr. Spock, tell us that. Please, family, advise me what you have done with your children. But God, you tell me what you want me to do for this child. Now, verse 8 says, first 3 words in the New King James says, and I gave you the first one. God listened. Let's stop right there. What did that just tell me about Manoah? He's a godly man. He's a righteous man. And God listened. And we'll say more about that in a moment. And we'll make a point about that. And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman. That's interesting, came back to the woman. Didn't come to, but he asked, come back to us. And the angel came to Manoah. Now what happens? Verse 9. God listened to him, and the angel came back and to the woman while she was sitting in the field, and she ran to her husband and with haste and said, look, he came back to me, the same guy that came to me the other day. So he runs verse 11, and now what happens? Are you the man that talked to this woman? And he says, I am. Now then, verse 12, here we go again. What did Manoah say this time? All right, let's stop right there. First, let your words come to pass, because you said he'd have a child. Secondly, now, what else? Yeah, you might underline. That ties with verse 8. What will be the boy's rule of life and his work? Powerful. We're going to let God decide his vocation. We're going to let God decide his work. We're going to let God decide his purpose. You see, the vocation of your child, you said, you find out you're going to have a child and you wonder, I wonder what this child will be. I wonder what their vocation in life is going to be. God's already decided that. And I don't mean God's decided they're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a plumber. But God's already decided their purpose in life. That's their vocation. From Ecclesiastes 12:13, to fear God and keep his commandments. God had already decided that. Powerful verses, verse 8, verse 13. Now, the angel said, and I need to pick up my pace because I want to get through. What happens now down to verse 14, 13 and 14? The angel repeated and said what? Yeah, she's not to drink wine, she's not to do et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He'll be a Nazirite. So now, begin at verse 15 through verse 18, what does Manoah want to do? He wants to prepare a young goat for him. Now, verse 16 is interesting to me, and I don't know, have the answer to all your questions, or all of my questions for that matter, exactly what goes on here. Verse 16, the angel said, though you detain me, I will not eat your food, but if you offer a burnt offering. So there must have been something said prior to verse 16 about making an offering, perhaps thinking this is more than just a prophet. He hasn't concluded yet that he's an angel. He will, but he wants to do something. But if you make an offering, then offer it to the Lord. It seems to be that I'm not to be honored, but you're to honor God. But he's not of the tribe of Levi. So some commentators make the observation that the following the law was kind of loose at this point anyway, so that was not an uncommon thing for one not a Levite to make an offering of a sacrifice without a Levite. Maybe so. Others say that there's an exception, maybe because this is an angel of God giving him permission to do so. I don't know. But when he did make an offering, God seemed to accept it, so I don't think he must have done wrong in making the offering. But now let's notice verse 17. Manoah said that, what is your name, that when, you might underline the word when, your words come to pass. Not if, but when. What does that tell you about Manoah? Strong faith. He believed that exactly what the angel had said is going to take place. So he took a young goat and made an offering. Now when he asked him what his name was, he said, why do you ask, seeing it is wonderful? The King James says secret. I don't think he's saying my name is wonderful. What he's saying is that my name is, that my answer to that is, it is beyond your comprehension. Anybody have the, is it New Living Translation? Incomprehensible. I don't have time to look that up, but I believe it's a New Living Translation. Very similar thing there. It is beyond your comprehension. It's too wonderful for you to comprehend. The New Century says it's too amazing for you to understand. The New Living says it's too wonderful for you to understand. Somebody else? Surpassing. Surpasses your understanding. I'm sorry? Okay. So it's the idea of it's too wonderful for you to comprehend and understand. That's the point. It's not that my name is, here's how you spell my name. It's wonderful, spelled with a capital W. That's not the point. It's too wonderful for you to understand. But then, as he offers this sacrifice, what does the angel do? In the midst of the flame. Now, there are two necessary inferences that are drawn here. The first is by Manoah. The angel never said, here's what I want you to know. But when he saw that, what did Manoah conclude? Verse 21. he knew he was an angel of the Lord. In other words, when he's heard all this that's been said, and then he saw him ascend in the fire up to heaven, now, that's an angel of God. She drew another conclusion. Not opposite, but he said, we're probably going to die because we've seen God. But what did she conclude from all of that? Verse 23. God's not going to kill us, but here's what I noticed from that. Yeah. The fact the angel ascended in the fire suggests God's accepting our offering, and he wouldn't have done that if he's going to kill us, and nor would he have shown us the things that are about to come to pass. So all of that suggests that there were two conclusions. They saw this angel ascend up into heaven, and that's an angel of God, Manoah said. And she's concluding God's accepted our sacrifice. Now, if that's all true, then they are assured the promise of a coming son is going to take place. Make sense? All right. Let's get 24 and 25. This is his birth. So she did have a son, called his name Samson. The child grew and God blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him in the region of Dan. Now, as I find the map, in what way did the angel of the Lord move upon him? I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. Some suggest it may be in righteous indignation against the Philistines. From a young child, he's developing this righteous indignation toward them. Maybe that's it. If that's not it, I don't know what it is. This is where he grew up, between Zorah and Eshtaol, right in this region of Dan. You see Ephraim just to the north and Judah. That's where he grew up. Now, this is interesting right here. This is an interesting point about the patience of God. Right here at we started at verse 1 with the Philistine oppression. The oppression is already strong. They need a deliverer. And God sends a baby. That baby's going to have to grow. That baby's going to have to mature before he's ever leading in this oppression, against this oppression. One writer says, God is patient, but he's never late. God's patient, but he's never late. You see, if I'd have been in charge of that, we have an oppressing nation, we need to find an adult that's already ready to go, and he's going to lead in the oppression. But God said, I'm going to send a baby and let him grow up, and he'll lead in that oppression. Which tells me my thinking isn't always the right way, then, is it? I see something about the patience of God. God sent a baby of all things to work. Now, practical lessons, question number 9. A couple of those I want to hit. Let's start with Samson's parents. Let's start at the bottom in case we run out of time. They seem to be close-knit. What gives me evidence that they're close-knit, that they're not just, we got married and we kind of live separate lives? What gives you the idea that they're close-knit in their marriage? Exactly. She had an encounter with a man of God. She went, first thing she did, go tell him. And when he prays, let him come to us. And the Lord answered and sent it to her. Close-knit. Has a whole lot to do with the marriage relationship. Both were righteous. They prayed. They were a praying couple. They turned to God for instruction before the child ever came. They didn't turn to God for instructions once they failed and said, God, we've made a mess. Now, is there anything we could look at your word, maybe find a way to fix this? That's not what they did. Before the child was born, they're saying, God, how are we going to deal with this? What do you want us to do? That's the better approach than waiting till it all fails. A whole lot better. What else did you put down in answer to question number 9? Practical stuff. Exactly. We'll stop at that. There are more practical things, but we'll stop right there. We'll continue with Samson, chapters 14, 15 next time.